What's an old rancher going to do? Dig a moat? HOA President Cordelia Blackwood sneered exactly that while demolishing my great-grandfather's 1924 bridge without warning. 24 hours later, she wasn't laughing. Picture the woman who called my family's century-old stonework a rustic eyesore, now knee-deep in muddy creek water, designer heels sunk in muck, perfect blowout ruined, watching her Tesla disappear under 12 feet of floodwater. "You hillbilly psychopath," she screamed across the water. "How dare you flood my home?" Her shrieks echoing across the submerged Whispering Pines development. Pure justice. The diesel fumes from excavators working all night. Worth every gallon. Her fatal mistake, assuming this old rancher knew nothing about federal water rights that predate her entire neighborhood by a century. Overnight, her luxury community became an isolated island. Me, the only fair airyman. What would you do if they destroyed your family's legacy? Because this revenge story gets so much better. My name is Ezra Hartwell, and I'm the third generation of my family to work this land. What's left of it anyway? 40 acres. That's all that remains of the 2,000-acre cattle ranch my great-grandfather carved out of Montana wilderness in 1898. The rest sold off piece by piece over the decades to cover medical bills, drought losses, and the kind of financial bleeding that slowly kills family operations like ours. But we kept the heart of it, the original homestead, the winter pastures, and most importantly, the stone bridge my great-grandfather built with his own hands in 1924 to connect our grazing lands across Willow Creek. I can still smell the limestone mortar dust from his workshop, still feel the rough texture of those hand-carved stones under my fingertips. Every morning for 30 years I'd driven cattle across that bridge, listening to the satisfying clip-clop of hooves on century-old stonework. The sound of home. That bridge wasn't just transportation. It was family DNA made visible in Montana stone, which is why when my wife Martha died 2 years ago, I'd sit on that bridge every evening tracing the initials. She'd carved there on our wedding day. Plus MH forever. The stone was warm from the sun, and for a few minutes, the $847,000 in medical bills didn't seem quite so crushing. Tuesday morning, 7 a.m., I'm feeding cattle when a white Tesla purred down my gravel drive like a shark in shallow water. Out steps this blonde woman in a business suit that probably costs more than my monthly feed bill. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, the kind of person who probably has her coffee maker professionally detailed. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Cordelia Blackwood, president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association." Her voice carried that particular brand of condescension reserved for anyone who owns livestock. The crisp scent of her expensive perfume clashed with the honest smell of hay and manure. "I need to discuss your bridge situation." Bridge situation? Like my family's century-old legacy was a plumbing leak. She pulled out a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "I'm afraid there's been a surveying error discovered during our recent development expansion. Your bridge actually sits within our HOA boundaries." I set down my feed bucket, metal clanging against the fence post. "Ma'am, that bridge was built 23 years before your development was even a twinkle in some city planner's eye." "I understand the sentimental value," she said with a smile colder than January wind. "But community standards must be maintained. The rustic aesthetic simply doesn't align with our property values." Rustic aesthetic. She was talking about my great-grandfather's craftsmanship like it was a rusted-out pickup on blocks. That's when she handed me the violation notice. 30 days to demolish. 47 signatures from HOA residents demanding immediate resolution of the eyesore issue. A list of contractors pre-approved for demolition services. The cherry on top, a business card for her husband's construction company offering to handle the job at a family-friendly discount. Because nothing says family-friendly like charging you to destroy your own heritage. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, keeping my voice level, "that bridge connects my winter pastures to my main ranch. Without it, I'd need to build 3 miles of new fencing and an alternate route that would cost $50,000. Money I definitely didn't have." not with Martha's medical debt crushing me like a slow avalanche. She clicked her pen with the precision of a guillotine blade. Perhaps it's time to consider whether cattle ranching is still viable in our evolving community. There it was, the real message. You don't belong here anymore, old man. I watched her Tesla disappear down my driveway, kicking up dust that settled on everything like a bad omen. The violation notice felt heavy in my callous hands. But Cordelia Blackwood had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just another broken-down rancher too tired to fight back. She was about to learn that the Hartwell family doesn't break that easy. 2 days after Cordelia's visit, a process server showed up at my door with enough legal paperwork to start a bonfire. The smell of expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the stench of intimidation tactics. The law firm's letterhead read, Peton, Hayes and Associates, one of those downtown outfits with marble lobbies and hourly rates that could fund a small country. The threat was crystal clear. Remove the bridge voluntarily or face a lawsuit that would cost me more than my entire ranch was worth. But here's the thing about being backed into a corner. Sometimes it forces you to remember skills you thought you'd forgotten. 28 years ago, before I inherited this ranch, I'd spent 4 years as a paralegal in the county courthouse. Back then, I'd learned that most property disputes aren't won in courtrooms. They're won in dusty basement archives where the real history lives. So, I drove my rusted F-150 down to the courthouse, breathing in that familiar cocktail of old paper and bureaucratic defeat, and started digging through land records that hadn't seen daylight since disco was popular. What I found in those yellowed files made my morning coffee taste a whole lot better. The original 1898 federal land grant clearly showed Willow Creek and a 30-foot easement on both sides as perpetual public access for agricultural and transportation purposes. My great-grandfather hadn't just built a bridge. He'd built it on federally protected land that couldn't legally be claimed by any private development. Something about grandfathered easements and federal water navigation rights that most modern lawyers forget to check. Even better, the environmental impact study for Whispering Pines had somehow managed to completely ignore the existence of my bridge. You know what happens when developers file federal paperwork that omits century-old infrastructure? The whole project becomes what lawyers call potentially voidable. Fancy words for oops. You might have to tear down everything and start over. I photocopied everything twice, then called my old Marine buddy Tucker, who traded his sergeant's stripes for a law degree and now specialized in water rights disputes. The conversation was enlightening. Ezra, hypothetically speaking, if someone built a development that blocked federal creek access, what would happen? Hypothetically, the feds could declare the whole thing illegal and force complete reconstruction, plus fines. Lots of fines. Why? Oh, no reason. Just curious about hypothetical situations involving bridges and water rights. Meanwhile, Cordelia was busy playing her own games. She'd convinced the county to send an inspector who miraculously discovered serious structural concerns with my bridge, cracks in the foundation, potential for catastrophic failure, immediate public safety hazard. The same inspector who'd somehow missed these serious concerns during 5 years of routine county inspections. I knew exactly where those cracks came from because my security cameras had caught 3 men with sledgehammers having a very productive 2 a.m. work session on my bridge. Men driving a truck registered to Blackwood Construction, LLC. Nothing says structural integrity concerns like a little midnight demolition prep work. When I confronted Cordelia about this nocturnal maintenance visit, she just smiled that refrigerator-cold smile. Mr. Hartwell, I hope you're not suggesting that county officials would falsify safety reports. That sounds almost Ellis. The woman was good, I'll give her that. But she just made her first real mistake. Here's something most people don't know about insurance fraud. Deliberately damaging someone else's property to justify your own actions isn't just unethical. It's a Class C felony carrying up to 5 years and $100,000 in fines. Thanks to modern security technology, I had about 40 minutes of high-definition video proving premeditated destruction of private property. The insurance company was very interested in these materials. So was the county attorney's office. So was the state environmental protection agency. Once they understood that someone was manufacturing safety concerns to bypass federal water access laws. But Cordelia wasn't done escalating. 3 days later, my insurance company called about complaints that my cattle were aggressively threatening visitors. Same day, the health department arrived to investigate unsanitary conditions around my livestock operations. The inspector, a kid who clearly knew cattle about as well as I knew quantum physics, spent 2 hours photographing perfectly normal barnyard smells and muttering about public health violations. That evening, I found fresh survey stakes driven into my winter pasture. Each marked future road development. The county planning office confirmed someone had filed preliminary applications to run a service road straight through my grazing land. Guess whose signature was on every application? The message was clear. Withdraw your bridge opposition or we'll bury you in legal battles until your great-grandchildren are still paying court fees. I sat on my porch that night listening to creek water flow under century-old stones and realized Cordelia Blackwood had just declared war on the wrong family. She wanted legal hardball. Fine, but she'd forgotten something crucial about small-town courthouse records. Sometimes they contain federal treaties that even fancy city lawyers don't know exist. Friday morning, I woke up to the rumble of diesel engines that made my coffee cup vibrate on the kitchen table. Through my window, I watched a convoy that looked like it was planning to invade a small country. 2 yellow excavators, a demolition truck, and enough equipment to level half of downtown. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes mixed with morning dew as Cordelia climbed out of her Tesla wearing what I can only describe as a victory outfit. Crisp white pants suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile you see on sharks right before feeding time. "Mr. Hartwell," she called out, waving an official-looking document. "I have wonderful news. The county has issued an emergent side demolition order for your bridge. Structural failure imminent. Public safety requires immediate action. Emergency order issued at 6 a.m. on a Friday morning." You know what I learned during my paralegal days? Real emergencies don't wait for convenient timing, but manufactured emergencies always happen when lawyers' offices are closed and appeals courts aren't in session. Basic intimidation tactic from the municipal harassment playbook. The demolition was scheduled for Monday morning. That gave me exactly 72 hours to remove any personal belongings from the bridge area. How thoughtful of them. I spent Friday afternoon at the courthouse filing an emergency injunction request, but it hit a brick wall faster than a cow in a tornado. The judge, who I later discovered was a regular golf partner with Cordelia's husband, denied my temporary restraining order without even reading the federal easement documents. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said, barely looking up from his papers, "county safety inspections take precedence over property disputes. The bridge comes down Monday." That's when I realized this whole operation was choreographed tighter than a high school marching band. Saturday morning brought a discovery that made my blood pressure spike. I was checking my cattle when I noticed fresh concrete cracks in my bridge foundation that definitely hadn't been there Friday. But these weren't the crude sledgehammer marks from last week. These were precision cuts made by someone who understood exactly where to weaken load-bearing structures. My security cameras told the whole story. 3 men with concrete saws and hydraulic jacks working by headlamp light from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. The whine of diamond-tipped blades cutting through century-old limestone. Same truck, same company logo, same federal crime being committed in high-definition detail. They'd actually sabotaged my bridge to justify destroying it. I called Tucker immediately. They're not just lying about structural problems. They're manufacturing them. Jesus, Ezra, that's criminal conspiracy, destruction of private property, plus obstruction of federal waterway access. I could hear him flipping through law books. We're talking serious prison time if you can prove premeditation. I can prove premeditation. Question is, can I prove it before Monday morning? Sunday evening, I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt absolutely necessary. I loaded my old deer rifle and spent the night sitting on my bridge, listening to creek water flow over stones my great-grandfather had placed with his own hands. Around midnight, the demolition crew showed up to stage their equipment. When they saw me sitting there with a shotgun across my lap, they decided to park at the property line and wait for daylight. Smart choice. Sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later. Young guy named Martinez, who I'd known since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Ezra, you can't be out here armed. You know that, right? Deputy Martinez, I'm on my own property with a legally owned firearm, committing no crimes and threatening nobody. Last I checked, that was still constitutional in Montana. He radioed back to dispatch, then walked over. Look, I understand you're upset about the bridge situation. What would really help is arresting the people who've been vandalizing my property all week. I handed him a USB drive, 40 hours of security footage, everything time-stamped and documented. Martinez looked at the drive, then at the demolition equipment, then back at me. Something in his expression told me he was starting to smell the same rat I'd been tracking. Monday morning arrived like a funeral procession. 2 sheriff's deputies, the demolition crew, county inspector with a clipboard, and Cordelia Blackwood standing off the side like she was watching her favorite soap opera. That's when my real insurance policy revealed itself. See, while Cordelia had been busy orchestrating this legal theater, I'd been doing some choreography of my own. Every HOA board meeting for the past month, every private conversation between her and the county inspector, every phone call to her husband's construction company, all recorded on the wireless microphones I'd been strategically placing around her favorite meeting spots, including last night's call where she'd explicitly discussed creating additional structural damage to justify emergency demolition before federal agencies could interfere. Sometimes the best defense is letting your enemies hang themselves with their own words. The morning after they demolished my bridge, I woke up to silence. No clip-clo of cattle hooves on century-old stone, just the hollow sound of creek water flowing where my family's legacy used to stand, mixed with the distant hum of Cordelia's victory celebration echoing across the valley. But Cordelia Blackwood wasn't content with just winning. She wanted total annihilation. Tuesday brought the first salvo of her scorched earth campaign, an anonymous health department complaint about noxious livestock odors, creating a public nuisance. The inspector, a pale city kid who probably thought milk came from cartons, spent 3 hours photographing my perfectly normal cattle operation while breathing through his mouth like he was touring a plague ward. Wednesday morning, property tax assessors materialized unannounced to reevaluate recent improvements. 15 years of stable assessments, but suddenly my ranch needed urgent review the day after losing federal appeals. Coincidence, I'm sure. Thursday brought noise violation complaints about my 6 a.m. cattle feeding schedule because apparently the sound of hay hitting feed troughs was disturbing. The suburban serenity that Cordelia had worked so hard to curate. Next, they'd probably complain about roosters crowing at dawn, but Friday's attack hit where it hurt most. I was driving my feed truck down the shared access road, the same route I'd used for 30 years, when I found orange traffic cones blocking my path like a line of plastic soldiers. A fresh sign reading private road, no through traffic, had sprouted overnight. Cordelia stood beside her pristine Tesla, clipboard in hand, wearing a smile that could freeze Satan's coffee. Mr. Hartwell, perfect timing. The HOA voted last night to restrict access on our private roadway. Insurance liability concerns, you understand? This road was built on a county easement in 1962, I said, tasting the metallic tang of barely controlled rage. You can't privatize public access. Actually, we can. Our legal team discovered the original easement only covered residential traffic. Commercial livestock operations require separate permits. Her smile widened, which were never obtained. That's when I realized how deep this went. Someone had spent serious money digging through 40-year-old county records, hunting for legal loopholes like a truffle pig, searching for buried treasure. The kind of systematic research that takes teams of lawyers and costs more than most people's annual income. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was a coordinated campaign to force me off land that had been in my family for 4 generations. Over the next week, the attacks came with military precision. Insurance complaints about unsafe livestock practices, environmental reports about cattle waste contaminating groundwater, fire department notifications about improperly stored agricultural chemicals, which turned out to be standard cattle feed stored exactly like it had been for 3 decades. Each complaint triggered inspections. Each inspection required per work. Each form demanded fees and legal responses that steadily drained my already empty bank account. But the psychological warfare cut deeper than the financial bleeding. I'd come home to find fresh tire tracks crisscrossing my pastures where vehicles had no business being. Security cameras caught HOA maintenance crews conducting midnight boundary surveys that somehow required driving across my grazing land with surveying equipment. When I called to complain, I was told they were ensuring compliance with environmental protection guidelines. Then Cordelia crossed the line that turned this personal. Someone filed complaints with the county cemetery board about the unauthorized memorial structure I'd built for Martha. The simple stone marker I'd placed by the creek, where we used to sit and watch sunsets paint the Montana sky, was suddenly unpermitted construction, violating county ordinances. They wanted to remove my wife's memorial because it didn't match their aesthetic vision. That's when I stopped playing defense and started playing offense. See, while Cordelia had been orchestrating bureaucratic warfare, I'd been conducting archaeological research in courthouse basement, and what I discovered made everything crystal clear. Here's something most people don't know about federal waterway law. Any creek that historically supported commercial navigation, even seasonal timber floating, remains under permanent federal protection. You can't just declare it non-navigable drainage because it's convenient for your development plans. My great-grandfather's 1924 bridge wasn't just family heritage. It was documented proof that Willow Creek had supported heavy commercial traffic for over a century. Proof that the entire Whispering Pines development violated federal navigation statutes that predate Montana statehood. But the real bombshell came when I cross-referenced Constru Shishin permits with original water flow maps. Cordelia's husband hadn't just built on protected federal land. He'd actually redirected the creek's natural path to maximize developable lot sizes. Environmental destruction for profit, all documented in the county's own filing system. I sat in my truck that evening, photocopied evidence spread across my dashboard like a treasure map, realizing I held documentation that could invalidate $15 million worth of luxury development and potentially send Cordelia's husband to federal prison. The question was whether I was angry enough to pull that trigger. After they'd threatened Martha's memorial, I was just getting started. That weekend, I called Tucker with the kind of urgency usually reserved for barn fires and medical emergencies. "I need you to look at something," I said, "and I need you to tell me if I'm crazy or if I just found the smoking gun that could blow this whole thing wide open." Tucker drove up from Billings Sunday morning with a briefcase full of federal water law textbooks and the kind of serious expression he used to wear when briefing missions in Afghanistan. We spread everything across my kitchen table: county maps, construction permits, environmental studies, and the yellowed 1889 Federal Navigation Survey that smelled like old leather and forgotten secrets. "Jesus, Ezra," he whispered, after studying the documents for 2 hours, the papers rustling like autumn leaves as he cross-referenced dates and legal codes. Do you understand what you found here? What I'd found was a legal nuclear weapon disguised as bureaucratic paperwork. The 1889 Federal Rivers and Harbors Act had classified Willow Creek as a navigable waterway of commercial importance, based on its historical use for timber transportation. Back when my great-grandfather was young, lumber companies had floated logs down this creek to railroad depots 50 meters due. WN Stream. That classification was permanent, couldn't be changed by county officials or state governments. Only Congress could modify federal navigation designations, and Congress had never touched Willow Creek, which meant every single house in Whispering Pines had been built on federally protected land that was supposed to remain in perpetual public trust. But it got better or worse, depending on whether you owned $1 million house on stolen federal land. Tucker pulled out his calculator and started running numbers that would make an accountant weep. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act requires any development within 100 feet of navigable waterways to maintain natural flow patterns and public access. Violation penalties start at $37,500 per day per structure. I counted luxury homes through my kitchen window while the morning coffee grew cold in my mug. 37 houses, all within the protected zone, all built without proper federal permits, all generating potential fines that would bankrupt small countries. How much are we talking about total? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Tucker's calculator practically started smoking from overuse. $1.4 million per day in accumulated violations, dating back to the first house built in 2019. We're looking at potential penalties exceeding $300 million. $300 million for a development that originally cost $15 million to build. Even Vegas wouldn't take those odds. But the environmental violations were just the appetizer. The main course was even more devastating. Look at this geological survey, Tucker said, pointing to the original creek path overlaid with current property maps. They didn't just build too close to the water. They actually redirected the entire creek to create artificial lot boundaries that maximize square footage. Here's something most people don't know about federal environmental law. Artificially. Altering navigable waterways without Army Corps of Engineers permits isn't just a civil violation. It's a criminal offense carrying 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The kind of charges that come with personal asset forfeit and can't be discharged in bankruptcy. Cordelia's husband could be looking at serious prison time, Tucker said quietly, plus environmental restoration costs that could reach 8 figures. That's when the beautiful irony hit me. Cordelia had spent weeks trying to prove my bridge was structurally unsound and environmentally damaging. But my bridge was the only permanent structure in this entire area that had been built with proper federal oversight and historical compliance. My bridge was legal. Her entire neighborhood was a crime scene. The environmental impact study claimed this was seasonal drainage, Tucker continued. But your bridge proves continuous year-round commercial navigation capability. That's deliberate falsification of federal documents, which meant every permit, every deed, and every insurance policy in Whispering Pines could be voided with one phone call to the EPA. I'd found the self-destruct button for Cordelia's entire world. The question was whether I had the guts to push it. Monday morning, I sat on my porch with Tucker, staring across the valley at Whispering Pines, while a plan took shape that was either brilliant or completely insane. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with morning dew as strategy crystallized in my mind like frost on a winter windshield. You know what the beautiful thing about federal water rights is? I said, savoring coffee that tasted like victory and diesel fuel. They include something called Agricultural Water Management Authority. Tucker raised an eyebrow. Meaning what exactly? Meaning any rancher holding original navigation easements can legally redirect creek flow for livestock watering, flood prevention, and erosion control. This was something I'd learned during my paralegal days. Agricultural exemptions in federal law are broader than most lawyers realize. No permits required except from the feds themselves. And since I already hold the 1889 easement, they can't legally refuse. The plan crystallized with beautiful simplicity. If Cordelia wanted to play legal hardball, I'd give her a master class in rural property law. But instead of destroying her neighborhood with environmental violations that would hurt innocent families, I'd create something much more poetic. I'd turn her luxury development into an island. My first recruit was Jake Thornberry, who ran Thornberry Excavation and owed me a favor dating back to Desert Storm. Jake was the kind of guy who could move mountains if you paid him in beer and gave him an interesting challenge. When I explained what I needed, he started laughing so hard he nearly choked on his chewing tobacco. You want me to dig what amounts to a medieval moat around a modern subdivision? Technically, it's agricultural water management infrastructure designed to prevent flooding and provide livestock access to creek water. And technically, I'm just a guy with heavy equipment who doesn't ask too many questions about creative landscaping projects. Jake's grin could have powered the county. How deep we talking? Deep enough that Cordelia's Tesla becomes a very expensive boat. Next, I recruited Maggie Lane, an environmental engineer who'd moved to Montana after getting tired of fighting oil companies in courtrooms. Maggie had two things I desperately needed: expertise in water flow dynamics and a personal grudge against developers who cut environmental corners. You want me to design a channel system that looks completely natural, but happens to redirect an entire creek around a luxury development? She asked during our coffee meeting at Murphy's Diner, the air thick with bacon grease and small-town conspiracy. I want you to design a restoration project that returns Willow Creek to its original 1889 flow pattern. I corrected. The fact that this happens to surround Whispering Pines with water is just historically accurate environmental compliance. Maggie pulled out her laptop and started running hydraulic calculations that looked like rocket science, mixed with ancient water witchcraft. The original creek bed followed a much wider meander pattern before development artificially channelized it. Restoring natural flow would actually improve fish habitat and prevent downstream erosion, and coincidentally create a 12 trillions wide waterway around the entire development. Pure historical coincidence. Her smile was sharp enough to cut titanium. I can have environmental justification paperwork ready by Thursday, completely legal under both the Clean Water Act and Agricultural Heritage Preservation Guidelines. The technical aspects were surprisingly elegant. Spring snowmelt would fill the restored channels within 48 hours of completion. Multiple connection points to the main creek would ensure continuous flow without creating actual imprisonment. That would cross legal lines into kidnapping territory. But crossing would require wading through knee-deep rushing water or finding very creative transportation solutions. Timing was everything. File agricultural water management applications Friday afternoon when government offices were closing for weekends. Start excavations Saturday night during new moon darkness. Complete the project before dawn Sunday. Then let Mother Nature handle the rest. My final recruits were Pastor Williams from the community church and Bonnie Sue Martinez, the county clerk who'd been watching Cordelia's legal maneuvering with growing disgust. Pastor Williams agreed to organize a community healing dialogue, scheduled for Monday after project completion. Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, he said with a perfectly straight face, and sometimes he needs help from heavy equipment operators guided by righteous anger. Bonnie Sue's contribution was more practically divine.
You know what's interesting about agricultural permits filed after 5 p.m. on Fridays?
She asked while stamping my paperwork with bureaucratic precision. They don't get reviewed until Tuesday morning at earliest. Gives folks plenty of time to complete urgent flood prevention projects over weekends. The beauty of the entire operation was its complete legality. Every permit properly filed, every environmental regulation carefully followed, every federal water right thoroughly documented. I wasn't breaking laws. I was using them more creatively than Cordelia's expensive legal team had ever imagined possible. Saturday evening, I stood in my pasture watching Jake's excavators move into position like mechanical dinosaurs, preparing for nocturnal hunting. Diesel exhaust mixed with evening mist, creating an almost mystical atmosphere, as if we were summoning ancient creek spirits to reclaim stolen territory. "You sure about this, Ezra?" Jake's voice crackled over radio static. "Once we start digging, there's no going back." I looked across the valley at Cordelia's house, where victory celebration lights blazed in windows that would soon have a very different view. "Start digging," I said. "Time for Willow Creek to remember where it used to live." The morning after bridge demolition, Cordelia Blackwood held what can only be described as a victory parade disguised as a press conference. She stood on the exact spot where my great-grandfather's stonework had been reduced to rubble, wearing a crisp, white blazer that probably cost more than my monthly feed budget, addressing reporters while the morning breeze carried. "Ed, the acrid smell of fresh concrete dust. Today represents a triumph of community standards over individual obstinacy," she declared, her voice carrying that particular smugness reserved for people who think they've just conquered a small nation. "Whispering Pines has successfully modernized our infrastructure while maintaining our commitment to property values and residential harmony." Behind her, Willow Creek flowed unobstructed for the first time in nearly a century, carrying away limestone fragments that had witnessed 4 generations of my family's history. The sound of rushing water over broken stone felt like listening to my heritage being erased, one pebble at a time. What Cordelia didn't know was that 12 hours earlier, I'd received final environmental approval for my agricultural water management project. What she also didn't know was that Jake's excavation equipment was already positioned at 3 strategic locations around her precious development, hidden behind natural tree lines like mechanical wolves waiting for moonrise. But her victory celebration was just the opening act of her final assault. That afternoon brought a coordinated attack that revealed the true scope of her campaign. My cattle feed supplier called to inform me that anonymous complaints about my credit history required immediate cash payments for future deliveries. My veterinarian received tips suggesting I was operating without proper livestock health permits. The county building inspector materialized to investigate structural concerns about my century-old barn that had somehow become urgent overnight. Each harassment was individually minor, but together they created a financial stranglehold designed to squeeze me off my land like toothpaste from a tube. This wasn't about bridge aesthetics anymore. This was about total conquest. The real escalation came when I discovered fresh surveys St. Ekes driven into my winter pasture, accompanied by notices that someone had filed applications for a scenic overlook road cutting directly through my grazing land. The proposed route would connect Whispering Pines to the county highway, providing residents alternate access that eliminated their need for the easement road I'd been fighting to use. Here's something most people don't understand about eminent domain. Local governments can seize private property for public benefit, but they have to prove the taking serves genuine community needs, not private developer profits. When I called the county planning office, I learned Cordelia's husband had filed this application as emergency infrastructure that would improve property values for the entire community. Public benefit. They were planning to steal my pasture and call it a taxpayer favor. But the psychological warfare reached its sickening peak when I found a manila envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside were photocopies of Martha's medical bills along with a typed note. Seems like ranch operations aren't financially viable anymore. Perhaps it's time to consider more practical alternatives before debt collectors get involved. They'd been investigating my deceased wife's cancer treatment expenses, using her final months as ammunition in their property war. The taste of copper fury filled my mouth as something cold and final settled in my chest. This had moved far beyond HOA disputes or zoning regulations. Cordelia had declared total war on everything sacred in my life, and she'd just made the fatal mistake of weaponizing my grief. While she'd been orchestrating this psychological campaign, I'd been conducting my own intelligence operation. Security cameras documented every trespass, every planted survey stake, every midnight inspection. More importantly, I'd been recording phone conversations between Cordelia and county officials, thanks to wireless microphones strategically placed around her favorite meeting spots. The recordings revealed corruption that stretched from City Hall to the courthouse, county inspector payments, judge golf partnerships, environmental study falsifications, a conspiracy designed to transfer my property to developers at distressed sale prices. But the most damaging recording captured her conversation with a private investigator hired to research my financial vulnerabilities. The discussion included explicit plans to use Martha's medical debt as leverage for forced property sales, along with strategies for manufacturing additional code violations that would make my ranch economically unviable. Apparently, widow shaming was just another tool in her real estate acquisition toolkit. As I sat in my kitchen that night, listening to Cordelia's voice discussing my wife's death like a business opportunity, I realized she'd just handed me the moral justification I needed for what was about to happen. At 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with Jake's text: equipment in position, weather's perfect, creeks running high from snowmelt. You sure about this? I looked toward Whispering Pines, where celebration lights still twinkled in houses built on stolen federal land by people who thought themselves untouchable. Start digging, I replied. Time for Cordelia to learn what happens when you declare war on Montana water rights. The distant rumble of diesel engines starting sounded like thunder, announcing the coming storm. Sunday morning, 6:47 a.m. Cordelia Blackwood's victory celebration came to an abrupt end when she stepped onto her patio for her morning yoga routine and discovered that her million-dollar view had been dramatically redecorated overnight. Where yesterday there had been manicured lawns and tree-lined walking paths, today there was water. Lots of water. Rushing creek water that had somehow found its way around the entire perimeter of Whispering Pines, creating what news helicopters would later describe as an unplanned water feature of unprecedented scope. The sound that escaped Cordelia's throat was somewhere between a shriek and the noise a deflating balloon makes when you let the air out too fast. By 7:15 a.m., she was on her phone screaming at county officials while standing knee-deep in muddy creek water, her designer yoga outfit providing an amusing contrast to the rural swamp that used to be her driveway. The crisp morning air carried her voice across the water like a public address system, broadcasting pure panic. This is illegal. This is terrorism. I demand immediate county intervention and criminal prosecution. What followed was 12 hours of the most entertaining legal theater I'd witnessed since my paralegal days. First came the emergency pump trucks dispatched by Cordelia's husband's construction company to drain the illegal water accumulation. That lasted exactly 43 minutes until Bonnie Sue Martinez arrived with federal water rights documentation, proving that any interference with restored natural creek flow violated the Clean Water Act. The pump operators shut down faster than a casino when the FBI arrived. Next came the sheriff's deputies, looking confused and slightly embarrassed as they tried to figure out which laws might have been broken. Deputy Martinez spent an hour examining my permits, while Cordelia ranted about environmental terrorism and criminal conspiracy. When he determined that every excavation had been properly documented and legally justified, Cordelia's volume increased to levels that probably violated noise ordinances. "You can't just dig a moat around someone's property," she screamed at the gathered officials. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez replied, with the patience of a man who dealt with share of unhinged HOA presidents. According to federal water rights law, he can redirect creek flow for agricultural purposes on land where he holds historical easements. which he does. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Cordelia had spent weeks arguing that my bridge violated environmental regulations. Now, I'd solve that problem by restoring the creek to its original 1889 flow pattern, which happened to isolate her development more effectively than a medieval siege. By afternoon, Cordelia had escalated to hiring private attorneys, who arrived in 3 black SUVs like they were planning to invade a foreign country. They spent 2 hours taking photographs, measuring water depth, and conducting what they called preliminary injunction research. The lead attorney, a sharp-suited man from Billings, who probably charged more per hour than most people earned per week, held an impromptu press conference that attracted every news outlet within 50 meters. This represents a clear case of harassment through abuse of agricultural exemptions, he declared, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Mr. Hartwell has weaponized federal water law to create what amounts to unlawful imprisonment of an entire community. What he didn't mention was that multiple temporary bridges could easily be constructed to provide access. What he also didn't mention was that his law firm was already under federal investigation for environmental permit fraud in 3 separate cases. But Cordelia's desperation reached its peak when she attempted something that crossed the line from legal hardball into actual criminal behavior. Tuesday evening, my security cameras caught her husband's construction crew attempting to dynamite the creek channels I'd excavated, not just fill them in, actually blow them up with enough explosive force to permanently alter the natural watershed. The kind of environmental destruction that carries federal prison sentences measured in decades. Deputy Martinez arrived in time to stop the detonation, but not before collecting enough evidence to file federal charges for attempted destruction of protected waterways. Watching Cordelia's husband getting handcuffed while she screamed about selective prosecution was almost worth the months of harassment I'd endured. The media circus that followed turned Whispering Pines into a tourist attraction. People drove for hours to see the Moat Ranch, taking photos and buying T-shirts from enterprising locals who'd set up roadside stands. The irony of Cordelia's property becoming famous for all the wrong reasons wasn't lost on anyone. Thursday brought the final desperate gambit. Cordelia hired a helicopter to airlift supplies to trapped residents, apparently believing this would generate sympathy for her cause. Instead, it created viral social media content as luxury homeowners were filmed being rescued from their own driveways like survivors of a natural disaster they'd created through their own arrogance. By Friday, environmental groups were hailing the creek restoration as a model for natural habitat recovery. Federal officials announced plans to study the project for potential replication in other areas. Property values in the surrounding area actually increased as wildlife returned to restored wetlands. Cordelia's war against one old rancher had backfired so spectacularly that she'd accidentally created the environmental victory she'd spent years trying to prevent. Sometimes the best revenge is letting your enemies destroy themselves while you provide the shovel. 2 weeks after the Great Moat incident, as local newspapers had dubbed it, County Commissioner Janet Walsh called an emergency public meeting to address what she diplomatically termed the ongoing water management situation. The Riverside Community Center hadn't seen crowds like this since the 1987 championship basketball game. Every seat was filled with standing room, only stretching to the back walls. The air was thick with tension, coffee breath, and the kind of small-town electricity that happens when neighbors are about to settle scores in public. On one side sat Cordelia Blackwood and her supporters, perfectly coiffed HOA residents who looked like they dressed for a country club dinner rather than a municipal hearing. On the other side, ranchers, farmers, and longtime residents wearing their best jeans and expressions that suggested they'd come to watch a hanging. Cordelia had arrived with a full legal team, a PR consultant who kept whispering in her ear, and enough documentation to start a small library. She'd also brought a large-screen television displaying aerial footage of her waterlock development set to dramatic music that made it look like a disaster movie. I came with Tucker, Pastor Williams, and a manila folder containing documents that would either vindicate my actions or land me in federal prison. The difference being that I was pretty sure which outcome to expect. Commissioner Walsh called the meeting to order, and Cordelia immediately launched into what can only be described as a legal performance art piece. Ladies and gentlemen, what you see before you represents the most egregious abuse of agricultural exemptions in Montana history, she declared, gesturing toward the aerial photos like a prosecutor presenting murder evidence. Mr. Hartwell has weaponized federal water law to terrorize law-abiding citizens and destroy property values throughout our community. Her lawyer played video testimony from trapped residents, describing the trauma of wading through knee-deep water to reach their driveways. One woman claimed she'd been forced to cancel her book club because guests couldn't navigate the hazardous water barriers surrounding her home. The performance might have been compelling if not for several inconvenient facts that emerged during cross-examination. When Commissioner Walsh asked about the environmental impact studies for Whispering Pines, Cordelia's lawyer suddenly developed a case of selective amnesia. When pressed about federal navigation rights dating to 1889, he claimed those laws were archaic and irrelevant to modern development. That's when I stood up and produced my folder. Commissioner Walsh, I'd like to submit evidence regarding the legal status of Willow Creek and the federal violations committed during the Whispering Pines construction. What followed was the most satisfying 20 minutes of my adult life. I presented the 1889 Federal Navigation Survey, proving Willow Creek's protected status. The original environmental impact studies that had been falsified to hide this classification. Documentation of illegal creek redirection that violated federal waterway protections, and recordings of conversations between Cordelia and county officials discussing how to circumvent environmental oversight. But the mic drop moment came when EPA Regional Director Sarah Lane stood up to address the assembly. Based on our investigation triggered by Mr. Hartwell's complaint, the Environmental Protection Agency has determined that the entire Whispering Pines development was constructed in violation of federal navigation laws dating to 1889. Her voice carried the authority of someone who could make very expensive problems appear with the stroke of a pen. Furthermore, the deliberate falsification of environmental impact studies and illegal alteration of protected waterways constitutes criminal violation of multiple federal statutes. The silence in that room was so complete you could hear someone's stomach gurgling 3 rows awa. Director Lane continued, "The federal government is prepared to offer a settlement that would allow current residents to remain in their homes, provided the development agrees to comprehensive environmental restoration and pays accumulated fines totaling $2.3 million. Cordelia's face went through several color changes that probably aren't found in nature. Her lawyer started frantically shuffling papers like he was looking for an escape clause in the laws of physics. However, Director Lane added, if these violations are not resolved voluntarily, federal law requires us to pursue criminal prosecution and potentially order complete demolition of all structures built on illegally privatized federal land. That's when Cordelia finally snapped. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, standing so fast her chair toppled backward. "You're all conspiring against legitimate business interests. This is nothing but rural bias and environmental extremism." The outburst might have generated some sympathy if she hadn't followed it by pointing at me and screaming, "That crazy old man destroyed my life over a stupid bridge." Commissioner Walsh gave for order, while Cordelia's PR consultant physically restrained her from additional outbursts. Pastor Williams stood up from the audience. "Maybe it's time we focused on healing this community instead of fighting over who's got the bigger legal stick." The room erupted in applause that lasted for 3 solid minutes. When the noise died down, I stood up for my final statement. "Commissioner Walsh, I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to protect my family's heritage and the federal water rights that belong to all of us." I looked directly at Cordelia. But when someone declares war on your history, sometimes you have to remind them that history fights back. The meeting ended with a standing ovation, and Cordelia storming out, leaving her leg. Al teamed to figure out how to surrender gracefully. 6 months later, Whispering Pines looked like a completely different place. And I'm not just talking about the permanent water features. Cordelia Blackwood had resigned as HOA president and moved to Arizona within a month of the town hall meeting, muttering something about hostile business environments and environmental fascism. Her husband's construction company had paid $1.8 million in federal fines and agreed to serve as the poster child for how not to develop near protected waterways. The new HOA board, led by residents who'd grown tired of Cordelia's authoritarian management style, voted unanimously to fund reconstruction of my family's bridge. But this wasn't just any bridge. They hired craftsmen who specialized in historical restoration to rebuild it exactly as my great-grandfather had designed it in 1924, using traditional limestone masonry and hand-forged ironwork. The bridge dedication ceremony drew over 500 people, including state officials, environmental groups, and 3 generations of families who remembered crossing the original structure. Cover. Governor Martinez gave a speech about preserving Montana's heritage while protecting our natural resources, and somehow managed to avoid mentioning that the whole thing started with an HOA property dispute. The environmental impact turned out to be even better than Maggie Lane had predicted. The restored creek channels created natural spawning habitat that brought native trout back to Willow Creek for the first time in 30 years. University researchers established a permanent field station on my property to study what they called agricultural water management as environmental restoration. The economic impact surprised everyone. Tourism to the famous Moat Ranch generated enough revenue for me to pay off Martha's medical debt and establish the Martha Hartwell Memorial. Al Scholarship for students pursuing agricultural or environmental studies. Local businesses reported their best year in decades as visitors came to see the bridge, the restored creek, and what the travel magazines called Montana's most photogenic water feature. But the real healing happened in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or tourist numbers. The annual Bridge Festival became a celebration of community cooperation, with former HOA adversaries working alongside ranchers to maintain trail systems and wildlife habitat. Local school children take field trips to learn about water rights, environmental stewardship, and what happens when communities work together instead of fighting each other. Property values throughout the area actually increased as the restored wetlands attracted wildlife, and the historic bridge became a regional landmark. The same people who'd signed petitions to demolish my eyesore were now bragging to visitors about their proximity to authentic Montana heritage. Jake Thornberry parlayed his excavation expertise into a thriving business specializing in agricultural water management and environmental restoration. He jokes that he's the only contractor in Montana whose business card features a moat, but the work is serious, helping ranchers and farmers implement water conservation projects that benefit both agriculture and wildlife. The federal investigation that started with my complaint expanded into a statewide review of environmental compliance in rural development. 16 other projects were found to have similar federal violations, generating enough fines to fund environmental restoration work across 3 counties. Cordelia's former mansion now houses the Willow Creek Environmental Education Center, where visitors can learn about water rights law, natural habitat restoration, and the importance of community cooperation in environmental protection. The irony of her home becoming a monument to everything she'd opposed wasn't lost on anyone, though we tried to be diplomatic about it during public tours. Every morning I still drive cattle across that bridge, listening to the familiar sound of hooves on stone while creek water flows beneath exactly as my great-grandfather intended. The carved initials from 3 generations of my family are now joined by EH 2020-5. My small addition to a legacy that almost ended with a demolition order. Sometimes I sit there in the evening, watching sunset paint the Montana sky, while water flows around what used to be Cordelia's island kingdom. And I think about how fighting for what's right doesn't always require destroying what's wrong. Sometimes it just requires helping the truth find its way back to the surface.